Okay, here we go. Here we go. Whims and caprices of the human spirit, right? Alright, we're talking about the antique shop. Mr. Evans had even discovered, for number two's systems of collecting curiosities was evidently rather philosophic than artistic, certain quaint objects, much more recent than the numerous anti-macassars, antimacassars. Never seen that word before in my life. And artificial fruits under glass, which he had selected, objects that the owner apparently thought significant of the age of his own early youth, such as rusty bicycle handles and tricycle wheels, and parlor games like Lotto and Spellikins. The thick golden light seemed to reach the eyes through some indescribably rich medium, like old sherry wine, which hung above all this chaos. And it was as if it had gathered to itself some magical potency that particular morning. Cordelia Gerd, for all of her new blue dress and overly ladylike hat, could not resist a queer sensation as she looked round the place as if she had entered magician's cave and had exposed herself to some unknown possibility of bodily transmutation. She felt as though number two's shop, in the same way as it could make mid-Victorian parlor games look like Roman antiquities, could transform a girl of the second decade of the 20th century to some platonic symbol of erotic expectation. It had been the southwestern wind and the lilac-scented air that had brought her into her fiancé's domain. But she had not suspected that this leaping up of life outside would be answered reciprocally among the littered simulacra inside. But as she stood waiting now, seeing no one and afraid of lifting her voice, she felt as if she were greeted in that sun-illuminated space like a chorus of muted whispers. The carved knobs of an early Victorian bed murmured extraordinarily things to her. A blue vase with big white basket-work handles became still more voluble. The girl in blue fixed a frowning glance upon this latter object. He must be upstairs making his bed, she thought. I would dearly like to make his bed for him. And then, gathering up all her forces into one terrific resolve, I'll make him love me like other men love their women, she said to herself. I'll make him love me like Crummy makes Red and Mr. Barter love her. Women can do those things. Women can make themselves like tinder to a match, like filings to a magnet, like straw to a spark. Cordelia's dark eyes began to gather a strange, exciting light, as her heart went on telling her heart what she would do to rouse the desire of Mr. Evans on this Maundy Thursday morning. She set herself a little intently, and she thought she did hear sounds, but oddly enough these faint sounds that she heard seemed to come from under her feet rather than from above her head, and they resembled the scraping of a nervous heel against a bare board rather than a rustling of sheets on a bed. Cordelia had never heard Mr. Evans refer to the chamber below stairs where reposed this curious volume, now separated from the St. Augustine and Aphrodite companion, that was such a danger to the Welshman's peace of mind. But she began to experience a vague sense of feminine uneasiness, totally without any rational cause, about her friend. He ought to be in the shop by this time, she thought. It must be nearly 10 o'clock. The sudden opening of the street door made her swing around. It made her heart give a wild jump. The figure who entered was Red Robinson. The man gave Cordelia a nervous nod. but he neither took off his cap nor offered her his hand, nor even closed the shop door. "I'm looking for Miss Worship," he said, with a sneer upon the syllables worship. "He's not at home. He's not at town hall. He's not at his office. Where is his worship? That's what I want to know. I've got something important to hox him." "Can I give my father any message, Red?" asked Cordelia. "He's no doubt at my home for dinner. Our midday dinner, you know, Red." The man hesitated. "Well, you might tell him that I'm said nothing more to that Morgan woman, since that his worship's pleasure. Nothing more to her, tell him, and all shall be as he wishes." Cordelia bowed gravely. "Surely, Red, surely. Yes, I'll certainly tell father that. He'll say no more to the Morgan woman according to my father's wishes." Red nodded, took out his pipe, and lit it in the doorway, and then cleared off. When Cordelia turned round after his departure, there was Mr. Evans standing before her. Mr. Evans looked at her in astonishment, as well he might. She was not only prettier than he had ever seen her, she was much better dressed. Cordelia had in fact gone with Crummy to Wallop's 3 days before, a thing which she had done only 2 or 3 times in their life, and had delighted her good-natured sister by the unusual interest she had shown in the new Easter display. The ex-mayor himself had come out of his self-appointed cage to wait upon the supposedly rich daughters of his ambiguous successor, and both girls had done all they could to soothe what they felt must be deeply wounded feelings. Crummy had positively forced Cordelia to buy a really becoming costume, and since their father had given the girls a hint that he wished them to deck themselves out well and do credit to their mother, this costume, including a especially graceful and very ladylike hat, now showed Cordelia, as the golden mounted rays surrounded her figure, to an advantage that surprised and bewildered Mr. Evans. The beautiful April weather, for seldom had Glastonbury known the approach of a more auspicious Easter, had quickened the blood and heightened the color of Mr. Garrett's eldest child. Ever since she had put on this dark blue, charmingly cut dress, and this neat gray coat with a gentian blue lining, the girl had felt as if she were a different person. A faint sense of spiritual shame at her own unexpected pleasure in these new clothes heightened the charm of her manner as she now talked to her fiancé, gave her, in fact, an air of virginal shyness and timorous self-consciousness, which Mr. Evans had never seen in her before. The boniness of her rather haggard face, the height of her rather sullen forehead, the forward drooping tilt of her awkward shoulders, all these things seemed mitigated to a point where they almost became the interesting characteristics of a woman of original distinction. For some reason, better understood doubtless by the Nietzschean young man who was Mr. Wallop's buyer than by Mr. Evans on the young man's herself, the coat lining and the blue dress with its thin braid of Brussels lace, when she threw the coat open, made the skin that covered the girl's collarbones seem as satiny and white as the sweet flesh of any much more flavored daughter of Eve. Whether from pure shyness or whether from some subtle feminine instinct warned her to be careful at this important crisis in her life, Cordelia refused to be more than to throw her cloak back as she took the seat in the rear of the shop offered to her by her lover. Mr. Evans hovered over her there and exchanged casual, unimportant remarks with her about he scarcely knew what, while his burning eyes, flashing forth from beneath his bushy eyebrows, devoured this little expanse of feminine whiteness. Something like a fresh water stream of quite new feelings towards this quiet girl surged through the man's poisoned and brackish senses. With an interior movement of his will, and the dire necessity of his distorted nature headed down Mr. Evans' will with engines of iron. He now closed down a formidable mental portcullis upon his dark congenital perversity. Not a trickle, not a drop from that deadly sluice must be allowed to poison this new feeling. For he recognized in a flash that if he could, at that very moment, hustle his guest off to his unmade bed upstairs, it would not be a penance at all, but a spontaneous pleasure to embrace her there. This was all the first time in Mr. Evans's life that such a normal and natural impulse had ever come to him. And it remained, yes, it remained at the background of all the torrent of words with which he now poured out, in spasmodic spurts of volcanic agitation, at the back of that sun-illuminated shop. I've been going on reading Dante, Cordy. How sweet you do look today. And I tell you, my dear, he's the only one of the great poets who really, to my thinking, understands life. Life's a war to the death, Cordelia. That's the truth, my precious, between the spirit of good and evil. These spirits are everywhere. They are encountering each other in every crevice of consciousness and on every place of being. Life springs from their conflict. Life is their conflict. If the spirit of good conquered entirely, as one day I hope it will, the whole teeming ocean of life would dry up. There would be no more life. Cordelia watched him carry off his breakfast things, for he had evidently risen hurriedly for some purpose, from his tea and rolls, and laid them in a row on a little shelf above the gas stove. A dedicated stream of sunlight, thick and mellow like sunlight in a monk's cell, kept turning his Roman profile, with its great hook nose and long upper lip, into a dusky bronze image that flickered vaguely before her, first on one hand, then on the other, as she listened and pondered in a passive trance of content. This is happiness, she thought to herself. This is what Crummy must often have known. And a great wave of pity ransacked her heart on behalf of all the old maids of Glastonbury who had no man, no hulking, blundering incompetent, fumbling helplessly with truculent inanimates. Oh, how easily she could have done what she had ever now so gropingly trying to do. Ooh, got whiskey in there. And how near she had come herself never to have had one of these creatures who could talk so excitedly, and crash went one of Mr. Evans's plates upon the floor. Could find the task of cleaning a table so pathetically difficult. Came back to her side now, lugging a great carved armchair after him, and upon this throne-like object he compelled her to sit, while he himself took possession of the small, upright Sheraton chair which she vacated. What none of you people in Glastonbury seem to understand, Mr. Evans went on now, is that the plane of charge and soak the desperate invisible struggle. Isn't there the same confusion, Cordelia dared to remark in a low voice, in ourselves? Certainly there is, Mr. Evanson cried, leaning forward over the girl's blue dress and pressing the palm of his left hand upon the arm knob of her antique throne. There's a whole pit of hell in ourselves, fire, smoke, sulphur, pitch, stench, burning. Some souls have a firm floor, Cordelia, that anyone can stamp on and it makes no difference. But other souls have trapdoors in their floors leading down to places unthinkable. The girl's mouth was a little open, and the black pupils of her eyes had grown round and large. She was sitting up very straight in that antique chair with her gloved hands. He hadn't thought of asking her to take her gloves off, and she had hesitated to do so, lest it should seem too small a gesture, holding tight to the wooden arms. But there was a space of several inches between her hand and their fierce grip upon the arm knob. I'm an unhappy man, Cordelia, he whispered hoarsely. Her eyelids contracted. A faint return of the exultant strength which had seized her that night in Chanis Hill shivered up through her rigid body. Now was the moment to let him know how he could depend on her, how she was ready to sacrifice everything for him. But fear and shyness made her numb, mute, helpless. Unhappy, he repeated in an almost inaudible voice. Her bloodless lips moved. She formed the words, I'm so sorry. But whatever they reached him or not, she could not tell. Oh, we're done for today. We'll continue with that conversation tomorrow. Until next time, try to get some rest.